All right, so if you've worked with other software development languages before, you will know what functions are. And functions have the same kind of basic idea in Python as well. So basically, functions are simply a way to group code together. And the reason why we might want to do that is, one, we might want to put code that is logically connected inside a function so that we can separate it from other code and we can call it independently. But also we might want to call that same code multiple times. Okay, a function can be executed 0 or more times, right? So you can think of it as putting some code aside and just calling it whenever we need that piece of functionality. So usually functions are grouped in a very logical way. A function achieves a certain purpose, and when we need that code, that functionality, when we have that purpose, why we might want to run some code, then we call the function and execute that code that it contains. Now, importantly, a function usually gets the same result, but not always, right? So it really depends on some variables that we have. It might depend on the time when the function is executed. It might depend on other variables. It might depend on a lot of things. But if we do not provide any variables, if there is no time dependency, then a function will get the same result every single time. So importantly, functions are quite deterministic. Okay, so they have some input parameters, they have some output parameters. Both of these are optional, by the way, but we kind of can't predict what functions will do unless we have just random numbers in our function code. Now, it can accept input and output, but it doesn't have to, right? So both of these are optional. We can have functions with no input, no output. We can have functions with only input and no output. We can have functions with only output and no input, and we can have functions with both. Okay, so these are completely independent. They are optional. Now, how do we go ahead and create a function? Well, it's quite simple. We have the keyword def, okay, define, keyword def, then we give the function a name. We put parentheses here, and we will see later on why, because here we might want to put some parameters to go into the function, but for now we are not doing that. So we give it a name, open, close parentheses, we have a colon, and then we have a block of code where we want to do something. Now, how do we invoke a function in our code? Well, we simply say function name and we put the parentheses, and that will run the code, the block of code that the function contains. Okay, so we simply call the function by its name and the block of code is executed. So let's take a practical example. This is how we define a function with no input parameters, no output parameters, a very simple function that only prints a message to the console. It simply prints hello everyone. Okay, so that is all that our function does. So let's go ahead and put our function in code. I'm going to say def, say hello, no parameters, so just open, close parentheses. I have a colon here, and then inside the block of code, I'm simply going to say print hello everyone with an exclamation mark at the end. So that is my function. If I run the code now, nothing will happen because the function is just defined, but it is not called. Okay, so this code will not run because it is inside the function and nobody is calling that function or accessing that functionality. If we want to access that functionality, well, we simply call the function like this, say hello. And I've put this inside a for loop that will run 3 times, so we will get 3 messages, hello everyone. So let's try that out. For I in range of 3, I'm gonna call my function say hello. All right, so if I run that, this is part of our program, and here we are actually calling the function, right? I think it expects 2 blank spaces, that doesn't really matter. So we are calling our say hello function 3 times, and this is when the call is actually invoked. Okay, there we go, we have hello everyone. So we have defined a function, we have called it 3 times, and the function simply performs its block of code that we have here. There we go. So the function must be declared before it is used. Okay, so this is quite important because we can define functions at any point in our code. It doesn't really mean that we need to declare it at the top like we did now, but importantly, we must declare it before it is called. So if I were to put this call here, down below, let me just get rid of that. Okay, and I'm going to do this. Now, if I declare my function after I call it, then I get an error unresolved reference because the system doesn't know what this say hello is. It hasn't been defined yet. Okay, if I try to run that, I will get name error, say hello is not defined. So we need to define the function before we use it. I'm just going to undo that, put it at the top here where it belongs. There we go. So that is the basic idea, the main idea of functions. So here is another example of another function. We are defining a function print numbers. And for each number in a range, we are printing the number and then we are printing an empty new line. Okay, so the reason why I want to do that is because I will kind of build a matrix of this using this function. And the way we do that, so here we are simply printing numbers in a row, and then we have multiple rows here. Okay, we are printing, we are using the print numbers to print out 10 rows. So let's go ahead and define that in our code. I'm going to say def print numbers. Okay, I'm going to say for I in range of 10. Okay, and then here I'm going to print I, and I'm going to give it an end empty string. So we know this already, we've used this before. This basically says do not put a new line at the end of this print statement. When we exit our for loop, then we will print an empty line here. And then finally in our program, I'm going to create a for loop, I in range of 10. Okay, and here I will call my print numbers. So let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. There we go. So we are creating a, you can call this a matrix, a table, whatever you like. Let me just put a space here. I'm going to put a formatted string with a space, dot format, and I'm going to put the I inside the format. So I'm going to have number and space. So let's go ahead and run the code now, and we are getting some spaced out numbers here. There we go. So that is the structure, basic structure of a function. That is how you define a function and how you can call it in your code to execute its functionality one or multiple times. So let's talk a bit about the names that you can give to your functions, the naming convention when it comes to function names. So function names can contain letters, numbers, and underscores. This is very similar to the variable names, so you can give them kind of the same structure of the name as a variable. Now, it must start with a letter or an underscore. You cannot have a function name that starts with anything else other than a letter or an underscore. Now, it is case sensitive, of course. So just like variables, function names are case sensitive. So there's a difference between lowercase and uppercase in the names. You can use underscore separated words. So this is a convention. It's not mandatory. You can pretty much name your function anything you like, but it's very common to see functions that have an underscore that separate the words. And that is because it allows the reader to understand and read the name much faster, much easier, right? So I kind of advise you to stick to this convention because you will see it pretty much in all well-formatted programming in Python. And importantly, don't give your functions names of functions that already exist. So for instance, if you name your function print, we already know that there is a function print that exists in the system. So you cannot use that name, okay? You will get an error. So here are some examples of names that are good and valid to use, right? So one simple name is, for instance, count, where you are trying to count some elements in some collection or an iterable or whatever it is. You should usually try to give your functions names that are representative of what the functionality actually is, right? So count kind of tells us already what the function generally does. Okay, it's short, it's representative. This is a good name. Something like print messages, that's also a good name because it tells the reader what the function does in a couple of words, and we respect that convention with an underscore between words. Then we have another example that starts with an underscore. So underscore my underscore function. This is also valid. You can use this format as well. And something like get info, it's very representative. You kind of know already, based on the context as well, you kind of know what the function will do. Now here are some examples that you should not or cannot give as names to your function. So for instance, 1, 2, 3 test, that will not work because it starts with a number instead of a letter or an underscore. This example, this is okay, but you shouldn't do it. This, you shouldn't really have functions named like this. For one, it's too long. And you should strive to have short, meaningful names. Okay, this is too long and it's not meaningful. We don't really know what this function does. Then anything else apart from letter, number, or underscore is not valid. So here we have an example that starts with a semicolon. That will not work. And here is another example. We are trying to define a print function even though we already have a print function in our system. So that will not work as well because we are masking some functionality that already exists. So there you go. Apart from these conventions and these rules, you can give your functions any names that you want. As long as they are representative of the functionality, you can use that name. Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about function parameters. So parameters are values that you can give to your functions that the function can later use as variables inside its code. So a function can accept parameters. They are also called arguments or args. So you might see that in different cases. Usually, it really depends on the perspective that you take. So a parameter is something you pass to a function. An argument is something a function has to be able to use inside its code block. But that is, detail. So here is an example. Let's say we have our function say hello, and we want to pass the name of a person to whom we say hello, right? So here we have print hello name. So when we call this function, we must pass the parameter inside the parentheses, right? So before, when we define functions, we put empty parentheses here. The reason for the parentheses is because that is where the parameters go. Okay, so we are taking one parameter, and here we are passing one parameter when we are calling the function. So let's go ahead and put that in our code. I'm going to define our say hello function. And here I'm going to expect a parameter named name. And then I'm going to print hello dot format, and I'm going to put the name inside that string. Okay, so when I call that function say hello, I need to pass that parameter, John. Okay, so when I do that, the John string is going to go into the name variable, and then that variable is going to be used to build the string hello name. Okay, so we can see the output hello John. Okay, so easy enough. Now, if we have multiple arguments or parameters, they are separated by commas. Okay, so here, for example, we are passing two parameters, name and times. So I want to print out that string a certain number of times. Okay, I have a for loop here. And when I call that, I need to call it with two parameters now, John and 3. So let's go ahead and change this. I'm going to have times. And then instead of the print, I'm going to say for I in range of times. And then I'm going to print that string this certain number of times that I've been given in this variable. So when I call this function John, I need to pass an integer here, let's say 5. And if I run that, I get 5 messages for John. There we go. So that is how parameters work. You can have as many parameters as you like if you separate them by commas in the function definition. Now, a function must be called with the exact same number of parameters that it defines. So if I have my function with 2 parameters like I have defined here, then I always need 2 parameters to call it. Okay, if I try to call it with only 1 parameter, then I get an error, missing 1 required argument. Okay, so I need 2 parameters here, 2 arguments. There we go. Now, just a word of warning, be careful with parameter types. Now, Python is a dynamically typed language, which means the parameter type is not known at compile time when we are building the program. It is only known at runtime. Okay, so here we define 2 parameters, 2 variables, but we don't know here if they are string or integer, right? We only know that when we are running the code and we see that the execution calls that function with a string and an integer. So it's important to be careful and to know what the function does, because we need to pass the correct types to our functions when we are calling them, right? So here is an example. We have our say hello function. If we try to call it with 2 strings, that will give us an error because we cannot use a string in our loop here. Okay, so always you need to be careful about the parameter types. So let's talk about default values for parameters. So function parameters can have default values. The main idea behind this is that in this way we make parameters optional for functions. So either we can provide a value for some parameters, or we can leave the default value if no value is supplied. Okay, so that means the parameter is optional when we are calling the function. So here is an example of how we can achieve that. Let's say we have a function that capitalizes a certain amount of letters from a message. Okay, so normally we only have amount equals 1. So here we give the default value of 1 to the amount parameter. Okay, so that means it will only capitalize the first letter of the message, but we give the option to capitalize more than 1 letter if we want. Okay, so we simply create a new message from the original message by capitalizing a certain number of letters, and then we have the rest of the message attached, right? So we are printing out the capitalized message. And here is how we can call the function. So either we can call the function with 2 parameters like we normally do, because we have 2 input parameters here. So we have a message, this is a nice day, and the value 6, and it will capitalize the first 6 parameters. Keep in mind that space is also a character in a string, so that is the first 6. Or we can call the function with only 1 parameter, so the message, and we allow the second parameter to take its default value. So if we want to specify a default value, we say parameter equals the value that we want it to have. And in this case, only the first letter will be capitalized because the amount will take value 1. So in this way, we are able to call a function in multiple ways, right? So either we call it with 2 parameters like this, or with 1 parameter. This is called function overloading. It is Python's way of achieving function overloading. So you might know that term if you studied other software development languages. If not, don't worry about that. We will talk about overloading later on in our course when we talk about object orientation. For now, the main idea is default values for parameters allow us to call the functions in different ways with multiple parameters by leaving the parameter empty and taking the default value if we want. So let's put this code in our PyCharm or in your preferred editor and try it out for ourselves. So we have def capitalize, and we have a message and a amount equals 1. So here we have our new message equals empty string for now. And what we want to do is go through the certain amount of characters that we have and capitalize them in the new message. So for I in range of amount, okay, new message plus equals message of I dot upper. Okay, so there we go. We have our capital letters, and we're going to attach outside the for loop. We're going to attach the rest of the message to the new message variable. So we're going to say new message plus equals message of amount colon until the rest of the string amount. Okay, so we're taking the rest of the message from amount until the end and attaching it to our new message. And then finally, we're going to print that new message here. So now that we have this function, we have two ways of calling it. So we can call capitalize with a message. This is a nice day. Or we can call capitalize with a message. This is a nice day. And a number of parameters that we want, a number of characters that we want capitalized. So I'm going to put 10 here. And let's go ahead and run this. So first off, we have the regular message. Actually, I could put a lowercase t in the message so that we can see the capitalization of the first letter. And let's go ahead and run this. So in the first case, only one letter is capitalized because the value is 1. In the second, we have 10 characters that are capitalized, okay, including spaces because spaces are part of the string as well. So there you go. That is how we can use default values for our parameters, and they allow us to call the functions in different ways with different values for our parameters. So for the last part of this section, we will look at return values. Now, return values are a foundational part of functions because they allow us to return a value, a result from a function, right? So a function returns a result, and to do that, we use the return keyword. The return keyword basically takes a value, returns it, and ends the function. Whether or not the return keyword is at the end of the function or not, when the execution reaches the return keyword, the whole execution of the function stops and the value is returned. So here is an example. We have our function square a number, and then we will return number times number, so squared. We're returning the square of that number. And here we have a for loop. We are printing out the squares of the first 10 numbers. Okay, so let's try that out. We're going to say def square a number. Okay, and we're going to use the return keyword, and we're going to say number multiplied by number. So that is our square function. So in our main program, we're going to have a for loop for I in range of 10, let's say, and we're going to print the return of square. Okay, and square, we're going to pass I as the parameter. There we go. So if we run this code, we should get 0, 1, 4, 9, and so on until 9 times 9 equals 81. So that is how the return keyword works. Now we can have more than one return keywords in a function. Okay, it doesn't really matter. Like we said, as soon as the execution reaches a return keyword, the function stops and the value is returned. So here is an example. Let's say we want to say goodbye for a name that is provided to this function, right? So we look at the first letter. If the first letter is A, then we return the string adios name. If the letter is B, we return the string bye. And if the letter is C, then we return ciao. Else, for everything else, we are returning goodbye. Okay, so let's try to put that in our code and see how that works. So we have a def goodbye name. Okay, now if name of 0, we're going to convert that to upper. equals A, then we will return an F string that will be adios name. Okay, then we have an elif name of 0.upper. I forgot the parentheses here in the first one. So name.upper equals B. Then we will return F by name. Then else if elif name of 0.upper equals C, then we will return chow name, and finally else we will return goodbye name. Okay, so depending on the name that we provide, we want to return a specific, a personalized goodbye message. So let's call this function with a few different names. So I'm going to print, first of all, goodbye Alice, then print goodbye Bob, print goodbye Carol, and then print goodbye Michael. Okay, so if we run that, we're going to get adios Alice. Okay, so the system arrived at this level. It found that it matches this condition. It returned our string and it skipped all the others, right? So it kind of makes sense. Then we have bye Bob, ciao Carol, and goodbye Michael. Michael doesn't fit any of these, and we get the default value here. So that is basically how we can return a value from a function. And you can, of course, return anything you want from a function. You can return any data type, a collection, a string, an integer, and as we will see later on, you can even return other functions. But that is a slightly more complex topic that we will see in a future section.